When I first opened my eyes, I thought I was in a car accident. The sterile white ceiling, the stiff sheets, the slow beeping of a nearby monitor, everything screamed hospital. My head felt heavy, like someone had stuffed it with cotton. I tried to sit up, but something held my wrists down. That's when the panic hit. I looked down and saw thick fabric straps around my wrists and ankles. I was restrained, my chest tightened, and I tried to scream, but only a hoarse whisper came out. A second later, the door opened and my husband, Scott, walked in, dressed like he'd just come from brunch. Khakis, light blue button-down, clean shave, cologne. He looked relieved? No, worse. Pleased. He sat in the chair beside my bed and gave me a soft smile, like I was a frightened child who needed comforting. "Hey, you're awake," he said gently, brushing a piece of hair from my face like this was some romantic moment and not the worst moment of my life. "You gave us a scare, but it's okay now. You're in good hands." I croaked out, "Where am I?" He hesitated. "Cypress Hills Behavioral Health, just outside Charleston." "A psych ward?" I tried to push myself up again, but the restraints wouldn't let me. "What the hell? Scott, why? What is this?" "Shh, Danny," he said, using the nickname only he used. "It's okay. You were confused. You don't remember? Last night you climbed onto the balcony railing and said you were going to fly. You were hallucinating, talking about your father being alive. You were in crisis. I had to call for help." That didn't make sense. None of it. Yes, I'd been grieving. My father had died 3 weeks ago. Yes, it had been messy. His lawyer, the will, the house. But I'd never hallucinated, never threatened to harm myself. "That never happened," I said. "I never climbed—" "Scott, I wasn't hallucinating." He gave me a sad, pitying smile that made my blood boil. "I didn't want to do this, Danielle, but I couldn't let you hurt yourself. The doctor said it's a short-term stay, a few days to stabilize, to get you on the right medication. Just rest. We'll talk later, okay?" Then he kissed my forehead and left. I laid there in stunned silence, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wasn't insane. I knew I wasn't. I hadn't done any of the things he said. But I also knew how this looked. Woman recently bereaved, isolated, now hospitalized. I remembered vaguely trying to call my sister 2 nights ago to talk about the will. She didn't answer. I hadn't heard from her since. I tried to recall what day it even was, how long I'd been unconscious. I couldn't remember. The fog in my head felt artificial, drugged. Had they sedated me? Later, a nurse came in. Her name tag said Megan, and she looked barely out of college. I asked her what medication I was on, and she hesitated before saying, "Just a mild sedative to help with your adjustment." I asked her if I could call my lawyer or my sister. She said I wasn't approved for phone privileges yet. Approved? I wasn't under arrest. I hadn't committed a crime, but I couldn't move. I couldn't call anyone. I didn't even know how long I'd been there. I asked to speak to a doctor. She told me he would do rounds tomorrow. That's when I realized the truth. I'd been involuntarily committed. My husband had done this. That night I couldn't sleep, not just because of the drugs in my system or the stiff bed, but because everything started to come into focus. My father had left me everything. The house, the land, and $600,000 in liquid assets. The paperwork hadn't even finished processing before Scott started suggesting I take something to help me sleep. He'd been unusually helpful, telling the attorney that I was emotionally overwhelmed, and I'd let him. I'd been too numb to think twice. Now I saw it clearly. This wasn't about concern, it was about control. My father had always warned me, be careful what people do when you're grieving. It's when the wolves come out. I never imagined the wolf would be my own husband. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, I promised myself one thing. If he wanted me gone to get my money, he just made the biggest mistake of his life. The next morning, I was awakened not by sunlight or a gentle knock, but by the harsh snap of fluorescent lights and the sound of shoes squeaking on the linoleum. A tall man in a white coat walked in, flanked by a nurse with a clipboard. He didn't introduce himself at first, just stood at the foot of the bed, flipping through a chart. Then, without looking at me, he said, "Daniel Harper, 37, Admitted 2 nights ago after a psychiatric incident involving suicidal ideation and psychosis. History of recent bereavement. Husband signed emergency commitment. I opened my mouth to correct him, to say none of that was true, but he raised a hand without even meeting my eyes. We'll conduct a basic evaluation. Nurse, the woman by his side, began to ask a series of questions. Name, date, president, memory check, and answered all of them correctly. The doctor scribbled something on his clipboard, then finally looked at me. His eyes were cold, clinical. Do you remember threatening to jump off your balcony? I stared at him. I never did that. Your husband and neighbors reported erratic behavior, he said. You were unresponsive, disoriented, speaking to people who weren't there. I shook my head. No, I wasn't. My husband is lying. He sighed, wrote something else, and said to the nurse, let's keep her on haloperidol for now, increase the dosage slightly. I bolted upright, or tried to. The restraint still held my wrist. Wait, no. You're drugging me because he said I was crazy? That's not how this works. He looked at me then, finally, and smiled the way someone does when they think you've confirmed their theory. Paranoia is often present in early stages of delusional psychosis. We'll reassess in 72 hours. Then he left. The door clicked shut. I could barely breathe. Haloperidol. That wasn't a mild sedative. That was an antipsychotic. Heavy duty. Capable of making even the most coherent person seem confused and catatonic. If they increased the dose, I'd be a zombie within a day. I knew what this was now. They weren't observing me. They were sedating me into silence. I had no phone, no access to anyone on the outside, and I was labeled a threat to myself. The walls were closing in fast. Later that afternoon, the restraints were removed. I was escorted into a common room with other patients, most of whom were either heavily medicated or lost in their own worlds. I sat on a vinyl couch and tried to think. The windows were locked and bolted, cameras in every corner. No clocks, no calendars, just a flat-screen TV playing static-filled morning news reruns. I asked a staff member what day it was. He told me it was Tuesday. That meant I'd been here for at least 2 nights. I needed a plan. Panicking wouldn't help. Screaming or protesting would only add fuel to their psychosis narrative. I had to be smart, controlled, normal. Whatever normal looked like in a place like this. I spent the next 2 hours watching everything. Who talked to whom, who looked lucid, who watched the staff with fear in their eyes. That's when I noticed her, a young nurse, maybe early 30s, brunette. Badge said, Amy. She was the only one not carrying herself like a guard. When she spoke to the patients, her voice was gentle. She helped an older woman tie her shoes and whispered something that made the woman laugh. I waited until she passed by me and said quietly, Amy, I need help. She glanced at me, cautious but not unkind. You need water? Or, I need to speak to someone outside. I've been committed under false pretenses. Please, I'm not crazy. Her eyes scanned the room, then the camera. Don't say things like that out loud, she whispered. Just stay calm. I'll come back. I didn't know if she was telling the truth or just placating me, but 10 minutes later, she returned with a cup of juice. Drink it slowly, she said, then added barely audibly, tonight, after meds. That evening, when the staff made rounds to hand out pills, I took mine, tucked it under my tongue, and spat it into the toilet 15 minutes later. I wasn't going to let them dull me down anymore. Amy found me in the hallway just before lights out and said, You need to keep your head down. Don't argue. Don't correct them. Let them believe you're stabilizing. That's your only way out. Then you help me contact my sister, a lawyer. She looked torn. Phones are monitored, but there might be another way. Let me think. The next day passed in slow motion. Group therapy sessions where people talked about hearing voices, doctors observing me like I was a specimen, staff watching for any sign of instability. I kept my face blank, my tone even. I said I was feeling better. I agreed when they suggested I might be overwhelmed by grief. I asked when I could speak to someone about going home. I lied through my teeth just to survive. Amy approached me in the laundry room 2 days later. Do you remember your lawyer's number? She asked, pretending to sort linens. Yes, I said without hesitation. Write it down, you'll have 5 seconds. She handed me a crumpled medication insert with a pen. I scribbled Samantha's number and passed it back. That night, I dreamed of my father's voice saying, "Don't let them tell your story." I woke up sweating, my mouth dry, but for the first time in days, I had something that felt like hope. 2 days after that, Amy told me she'd gotten a message to Samantha through a friend who worked nights at the front desk. If your lawyer can prove that your admittance was based on false claims, and if your mental evaluations don't support your husband's narrative, there's a way to trigger a review hearing. But it takes time. Do I have time? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her pocket and handed me a folded paper. "This was in your file. I wasn't supposed to take it, but you need to see it." Inside was a copy of the admittance form. My husband had signed it, stating I was delusional, aggressive, and a danger to myself and others. He checked every box, and next to my name, under the next of kin section, was a single name, Scott Harper, sole contact, no other family listed. I nearly choked. He'd isolated me completely. Amy whispered, "He told them you were estranged from everyone, that he was the only one left, that you had no one." I folded the paper and slipped it into my waistband. Then he's going to be very surprised when someone shows up. The next morning, I asked to speak to the attending doctor. I told him I was feeling much clearer. I apologized for my emotional outbursts. I said I was beginning to understand how grief had affected me. He seemed pleased. "Progress," he said. "That's what we want to see." But what I wanted him to see was fear. Because the truth was, for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of breaking. I was afraid of surviving this and doing nothing about it. I didn't know how long I had before Scott moved my inheritance, or sold the land, or tried something worse. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The next time someone tried to write my story, they'd do it from the witness stand. The day I began pretending to be crazy was the day I started taking control back. It went against every instinct I had. My entire life had been built on composure, rationality, poise. But in this place, being calm made them suspicious. It made them think I was manipulating. Being reasonable didn't mean sanity here, it meant denial. So I flipped the script. I stopped resisting the narrative and started playing the role they wanted from me, just enough to lower their guard. I nodded through therapy, spoke in quiet tones about missing my father, admitted to feeling confused about what was real and what wasn't. I even thanked the doctor for helping me see things clearly again. It disgusted me, but I kept going. Every day I endured their nods of approval, their condescending praise for progress, all while Amy and I quietly assembled pieces of the truth behind their back. Amy had managed to pass a message to Samantha, and 2 days later, I was quietly pulled from group therapy and escorted to a private office. "Legal consultation," they said. It was a small victory, but I knew better than to show it. Samantha was already waiting, seated at a bare metal desk. She stood when she saw me, and for a second, her eyes betrayed something like shock. I must have looked awful, pale, thinner, exhausted, but she said nothing about that. She just opened her folder and got to work. "You're listed as mentally unfit to manage personal or financial affairs," she said without preamble. "Your husband submitted that you'd been experiencing delusions and hallucinations for over a month, citing multiple incidents, none of which appear in any police or medical records. He's filed for conservatorship. He's trying to take control of the inheritance," I said. "Shay already filed paperwork to move funds from your father's estate into a joint trust," she confirmed. "But it hasn't cleared yet. I filed an emergency motion to freeze all financial activity related to the estate and the Harper Trust." I exhaled slowly, trying not to cry. "How soon can I get out of here?" "That's harder. Since you were admitted under an emergency commitment signed by your spouse, you'll need an independent psychiatric evaluation. I've requested one. It was denied." My stomach turned. "So I'm not forever. But we need to play their game for now." She leaned forward. "Danielle, I know this isn't what you want to hear, but you need to keep pretending. Keep playing along. Build a record of stability. Show that you're improving under their care." I nodded. I'd already started. Amy and I escalated things after that. She began documenting inconsistencies in my medical chart. She took photos of medication logs showing overdosage. She smuggled me copies of case notes written by the staff, claiming I'd displayed behaviors I never had. She spoke in fragmented thoughts today, one note read. Exhibited paranoia during group session. I'd said 3 coherent sentences about missing my father. That was all it took to label me unstable. One night, Amy slipped me a USB drive inside a tube of lip balm. "Hide this. Don't lose it," she whispered. On it were scans of internal staff memos, including one particularly damning message between the facilities director and my husband. It read, "Patient's husband has asked to be updated on progress weekly. Continue current meds until he indicates readiness to transition her home. He's requested she not be contacted regarding financial decisions at this time. He was pulling the strings from outside, managing my so-called treatment like a business transaction. Worse, the facility was cooperating. The only leverage I had was my mind. I clung to it with everything I had. I studied every interaction. I took mental notes of every shift change, every staff behavior, every security blind spot. Amy trained me in how to access the staff records console briefly when the nurses rotated stations. We timed it carefully, 40 seconds at most, just enough to print the intake forms and a copy of my medication protocol. The documents showed I'd been placed on a regimen meant for patients with violent schizophrenia despite no history or diagnosis to support it. I memorized every detail, and then, when the time was right, I requested a meeting with the doctor. "I think I'm ready to be considered for discharge," I said. He smiled politely. "You've made excellent progress, Danielle. But we'll need more time to monitor your stability." "I've had no outbursts," I said. "I've complied with medication. I've participated in group. I feel clear, focused. Don't you agree?" He glanced at his notes. "Yes, but your condition was severe. 1 week of compliance isn't enough." "So what is?" He shrugged. "We'll evaluate again in 2 weeks." That night, Amy and I adjusted the plan. If I couldn't get out now, I'd make sure everything he said and did from that point forward would become part of his undoing. A week later, during evening rounds, Amy was called away early. A replacement nurse came by to administer my medication. 2 white pills and a capsule I didn't recognize. I asked what they were. She said she didn't know, just that they were listed in my file. I took the cup but didn't swallow. Back in my room, I pulled out the lip balm tube and transferred the pills into the false bottom Amy had built in. I'd have them tested later. The next day, Amy confirmed that I'd been given a mood stabilizer that wasn't on my official chart. "They're experimenting now," she said quietly. "If they think you're compliant, they stop recording every change." I began recording my own notes, in my head. I kept track of names, doses, reactions, keywords from therapy. I knew it might be weeks before Samantha could get me out, but I wasn't just going to wait. I was building a case, one that could bring this place down. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was a Saturday night. The halls were quiet. Amy was on shift, and I was in the hallway outside the rec room when I heard 2 men speaking in low voices behind a half-open office door. I stopped. One of them was my husband. "I need to know when she's stable enough to release," Scott said. 2 more weeks, the doctor replied. "We've increased her dose again, but she's still sharp." "He can't be sharp," Scott said. "I need her disoriented when she signs." "He won't be legally capable of signing anything until she's declared lucid. You want her to stay confused? That's a different conversation." There was silence. Then the doctor added, "You do understand what you're asking me to do. I'm asking you to continue what you've already been doing. And I'll double the payments, as agreed." I backed away from the door, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. But they didn't. They kept talking. When I returned to my room, I sat on the bed for 10 minutes in silence before I whispered, "Amy, I need to go further." She looked at me, concerned. "How much further?" "I need him, the doctor, I need him on record. I need him to say what he just said again, and I need to be the one holding the recorder when he does." Amy closed the door and turned the lock. Then she pulled a small voice recorder from her pocket and placed it in my hand. I wasn't free yet, but I was no longer trapped, and that made me more dangerous than either of them could ever imagine. 2 days after I'd recorded the conversation between Scott and the doctor, everything began to shift. I wasn't just playing defense anymore. I had ammunition, real proof. For the first time, I had something more than just my word against theirs. I listened to that recording every night before bed, not for the satisfaction of hearing them conspire, but to remind myself what I was fighting for. My father's legacy, my freedom, my dignity. I wasn't just going to get out. I was going to destroy the structure they'd built to trap me. Amy transferred the recording to a second USB, which she promised to get into Samantha's hands the following week. "She'll know what to do with it," she said. "But you need to stay clean until then. No incidents, no slip-ups." I nodded. My hands were steady now. My mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. No more fake pills, no more fog, just focus. The facility continued their performance therapy sessions, evaluations, the occasional group outing to the fenced garden where patients wandered like sleepwalkers. I became a model of progress. I smiled at staff, answered questions calmly, nodded through group check-ins. I made the doctor believe his manipulation was working, that I was just another grateful, broken woman recovering under his expertise. But inside, I was memorizing every word, every phrase he repeated to justify keeping me there. Delusional fixation on her husband's motives, recurrent episodes of mistrust, borderline behavior triggered by grief. The more he believed in his own diagnosis, the more careless he became. He stopped monitoring his phrasing, confident that I was slipping into complacency. But I was only growing sharper. He didn't know I was documenting every lie. Meanwhile, Amy continued collecting internal communications, emails from Scott, handwritten instructions from administrators, patient logs with edited timestamps. One note from the director read, "Patient Harper's trust disbursement status remains pending. Recommend continued sedation protocol until legal process finalized." That was the phrase I couldn't forget. Not until recovery, not until safety is ensured, until the money cleared. That's what I was to them, a temporary inconvenience blocking the pipeline of profit, a signature waiting to be forced. One night, Amy brought me to the staff supply room during shift change. She unlocked a cabinet and pulled out a manila folder thick with paperwork. "This is everything we have on you. Treatment logs, charts, behavior reports. I made copies. You'll need them." I flipped through the contents, noting how many lies had been turned into formal reports. In one, it said I had violently resisted medication on day 4. I remembered day 4. I was in bed all morning. I hadn't even spoken. Another entry claimed I exhibited self-harmed ideation on day 9. That was the day I asked if I could draw with a pencil in art therapy. They'd spun everything into a narrative of instability. The story they wanted to tell wasn't just being written, it had been edited and polished. They were preparing for a legal defense before I even left. By the end of that week, Amy had managed to get all our evidence to Samantha. The recording, the documents, the falsified logs, and the forged emails. It wasn't just enough to suggest misconduct, it was enough to bury them. Samantha moved fast. Within 72 hours, she filed a formal complaint with the South Carolina Department of Mental Health and submitted an affidavit requesting an immediate mental competency hearing with third-party evaluation. The facility hadn't seen it coming. They were blindsided when a court-appointed psychiatrist showed up on Monday morning, unannounced, demanding access to me without supervision. The staff tried to stall, but Samantha had already obtained a judge's order. They couldn't deny it. The evaluation took place in a sterile office with 2 guards posted nearby and a court reporter recording every word. The psychiatrist was professional, detached, and refreshingly thorough. He asked real questions. He listened. He read the file, looked at me, and frowned. "You were placed on a schizophrenia protocol within 24 hours of admission without any documented psychotic episode. That's unusual. It was deliberate," I said. "They weren't treating me. They were hiding me." After an hour, he stood, shook my hand, and said, "You won't be here much longer." 2 days later, I was released. They didn't want a scene. No apologies, no explanations. Just a paper signed by the same doctor who once called me a danger to myself. This time, it said patient no longer meets criteria for involuntary hold. That was their way of folding, quietly, hoping I'd disappear just as discreetly as I had arrived. But I wasn't disappearing. I was stepping out of that building with an arsenal, and they had no idea how loud my next move would be. Scott was waiting for me outside the gates. His black SUV was polished, and he was wearing that fake, concerned expression he used in courtrooms when he wanted to look sympathetic. "I'm so glad you're better," he said, pulling me into a stiff hug. "Let's go home." I pulled back and looked him in the eye. "You're not driving me anywhere." He blinked. "Donnie, You drugged me. You signed forms declaring me insane. You coordinated with a doctor to keep me sedated so you could control my inheritance." His face turned pale. "What are you talking about?" I pulled a flash drive from my pocket and held it between two fingers. "I have your conversations. I have your emails. I have your voice paying for silence." He reached for it, and I stepped back. "Touch me, and I'll scream so loud your entire professional world will come running." From the parking lot, Samantha emerged, followed by two officers. One handed Scott a thick envelope. "You've been served," the officer said. "Restraining order, emergency injunction, and notice of investigation for financial fraud, spousal abuse, and medical conspiracy." Scott's expression collapsed into something between fury and disbelief. "You don't know what you're doing," he hissed at me. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, stepping past him toward Samantha. "I'm taking my life back." We drove away in silence. I watched the facility disappear in the rearview mirror and didn't look back. Not because I wanted to forget it, but because I wasn't done with it yet. That place hadn't just held me. It had enabled him, protected him, and I wasn't going to stop until every person who signed a false report, who took a bribe, who looked away when I was strapped to a bed and told I was broken, faced consequences. I wasn't just free. I was angry. And I was done playing sane just to be believed. Now I was going to make them all listen. The first court hearing was set for a Thursday morning in a downtown Charleston civil courtroom. I arrived early, dressed in a navy suit and low heels, hair pulled back, no makeup. Calm, composed, professional. I wanted them to see me and know without a doubt that I was no one's victim anymore. Samantha met me on the steps, already holding a thick binder of documents. She looked confident, but I could see it in her eyes. She was ready for a fight. "He'll deny everything," she warned as we walked toward the entrance. "Even with the audio, even with the forged documents, he'll spin it. And he has money. His attorney is known for dragging things out. This won't be clean." I didn't need it to be clean. I needed it to be public. Inside, Scott sat at the plaintiff's table, surrounded by his legal team, all pristine suits and smug expressions. He barely looked at me, but I felt his eyes flicker up as I walked past. His expression didn't carry guilt or fear, just irritation, like I'd inconvenienced him, like I was a stubborn loose end he thought he'd already snipped. The judge was a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes. She didn't smile, she didn't soften anything. When she called the session to order, the courtroom settled into a tight, expectant silence. Scott's lawyer went first, launching into a performance so polished, it made me sick. He painted Scott as a loving, desperate husband who had intervened in a mental health crisis out of deep concern for his wife's well-being. He referenced episodes of instability, bizarre behaviors, emotional breakdowns, none of which were documented, of course. He called my actions since release vindictive and unstable, suggesting that I had manufactured evidence out of spite. I watched the judge's face, but she didn't react. She just took notes, nodded occasionally. When they were done, Samantha stood and walked slowly to the center of the courtroom. She didn't start with the recording. She started with the timeline: my father's death, the inheritance, the trust, the sudden change in Scott's behavior, the commitment. She detailed how quickly he filed paperwork to gain control of my assets. She read directly from the hospital's internal memos, the ones Amy had given us, highlighting phrases that made the courtroom murmur: hold patient until financial documents processed, liaise with husband on release readiness, maximize sedative effect. Then she played the audio. The courtroom went still as Scott's voice filled the room. "I need her disoriented when she signs." And then the doctors. Continue current meds. He's requested she not be contacted regarding financial decisions. When it ended, the judge looked up for the first time and stared directly at Scott. I couldn't tell what she was thinking, but I knew the tide had shifted. Still, they pushed back. Scott's team argued that the audio could have been edited, that the context was unclear, that my mental health history, however undocumented, could explain erratic behavior. They demanded the court throw out the internal memos on grounds of privacy violations. Samantha held her ground, rebutting each point with surgical precision. She cited whistleblower protection laws, South Carolina healthcare regulations, and digital chain of custody documentation for every piece of evidence we'd submitted. Then Scott took the stand. He was charming, of course. Warm voice, slight tilt of the head, practiced remorse. He talked about our marriage, about watching me slip away after my father's death. He said I'd been irrational, unpredictable, paranoid. He described fabricated episodes, me screaming at shadows, accusing strangers of conspiracy. I didn't want to commit her, he said. It broke my heart, but I was afraid she'd hurt herself or someone else. I sat perfectly still. I didn't blink. The lies didn't hurt me anymore. They revealed him. Every word he spoke dug him deeper. Then Samantha stood and asked him one question. Mr. Harper, are you aware that your wife had her medication independently tested and found traces of antipsychotics not listed in her treatment protocol? He hesitated. No, I wasn't aware. Are you aware that the doctor who prescribed them is now under investigation by the state medical board for ethics violations? I had no part in that, he said quickly. She took a step closer. So, you deny meeting with Dr. Conroy outside the hospital during her stay? I met with him once, as any concerned husband would. Would you consider discussing your wife's sedation levels and legal readiness to sign documents part of your concern for her health? His jaw clenched. I have no further questions. But I did. We hadn't planned on me speaking, but the judge asked if I wanted to make a statement before recess. I stood, slowly, walked to the front of the room, and looked directly at Scott. This man tried to erase me, I said. He drugged me, lied about my sanity, locked me away, and planned to take every part of my life I hadn't even finished grieving. He didn't do this out of fear or love. He did it because he saw an opportunity. And when I didn't collapse the way he wanted, he tried to paint me as angry, vindictive, hysterical. I turned to the judge. I've been called crazy, broken, fragile. But I survived something most people don't come back from. Not just the drugs, not just the lies, but the complete rewriting of my reality. And I came back with proof. There was no applause, no gasp, just a silence that felt heavier than anything I'd experienced inside that hospital. The judge adjourned the session. A decision would be delivered within the week. Outside the courthouse, the press waited. The recording had leaked. Samantha denied being the source, and now reporters were hounding both sides. I didn't speak to them, not yet, not until I had a verdict. 3 days later, we got the ruling. The judge upheld the emergency injunction, freezing Scott's access to any shared assets. A temporary conservatorship was granted. To meet the mental health facility was referred to state and federal investigators. The doctor's license was suspended pending a formal ethics hearing, and Scott was placed under investigation for fraud, perjury, conspiracy, and attempted medical abuse. It wasn't the end. There would be depositions, hearings, maybe a trial, but the ruling had been clear. The court believed me. My story wasn't a delusion. It was evidence. Evidence of a system manipulated by someone who thought money and charm could bury the truth. That night, I sat on my father's porch. The house was still empty, still in probate, but it was mine now. I watched the stars, sipped tea, and let myself breathe. I wasn't free of the fight, but I was no longer fighting to be heard. I was fighting to be followed, and that was an entirely different kind of power. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal filings, interviews, and subpoenas. Samantha was relentless, pushing the civil and criminal proceedings forward while keeping me informed at every turn. She made it clear this was no longer just about my case. It had become a warning shot, aimed at the entire system that enabled what had happened to me. The hospital administration lawyered up immediately. The facility issued a statement denying all wrongdoing, claiming their treatment protocols had followed standard psychiatric guidelines, and that they were fully cooperating with the ongoing investigation. But we had the documents, we had the audio, and we had something even more powerful: momentum. Whispers turned into headlines: local woman falsely committed by husband to steal inheritance, mental health facility under fire for alleged collusion. The more they tried to control the narrative, the more it slipped through their fingers. The turning point came when the Dr. Michael Conroy was called to testify during a pre-trial deposition. He arrived in an expensive suit, flanked by attorneys who clearly coached him to keep his answers clipped and non-committal. But the moment Samantha presented the payment records, his demeanor shifted. Monthly deposits from a private shell company owned by Scott, matching withdrawals from accounts associated with Conroy's vacation property. At first, he claimed they were consulting fees. When asked what he had consulted on, he hesitated for too long. Then came the question that changed everything. "Dr. Conroy, are you aware that audio was submitted in which you can be heard discussing keeping a patient sedated until financial documents cleared?" He froze. One of his lawyers whispered something, but Conroy didn't speak. He just stared ahead like he'd finally understood the magnitude of what he'd done. And then, in a move we hadn't dared to hope for, he said, "I'd like to amend my statement and request immunity in exchange for full cooperation." That single sentence detonated the case wide open. Conroy's testimony confirmed everything: Scott's meetings, the cash payments, the forged evaluations, and even attempts to backdate certain treatment records. He admitted he had falsified the diagnosis code used to justify my hold. He'd told staff I was potentially violent without evidence, had doubled my medication doses on Scott's instructions, and had coordinated with administrators to delay any discharge review until Scott gave the signal. It was about the money, he said under oath. He told me she had a large inheritance and needed to be kept out of the way until the estate was under his control. His voice cracked when he said it. "I did it because I thought I could get away with it. Because we always get away with it." That statement ended his career and likely saved dozens of other women from suffering what I had. He would lose his license permanently, be barred from practicing in any state, and possibly face jail time, depending on the federal charges still in review. But most importantly, it meant Scott had lost his most important ally. There was no longer anyone to hide behind. Samantha moved to escalate the case into full criminal proceedings. Scott was served with a formal indictment that included charges of financial fraud, attempted grand larceny, unlawful confinement, and conspiracy to commit medical malpractice. He posted bail within hours, of course. He still had access to some money, and he still believed that his status, his network, and his charm would protect him. But the courtroom was no longer his stage, it was mine. At the formal arraignment, Scott walked in wearing a tailored gray suit, trying to exude calm. I watched him from across the aisle, flanked by my team, Amy sitting beside me. She had resigned from the facility a week after my release and had offered to testify as well. Her documentation, paired with Conroy's confession, was airtight. When Scott stood to enter his plea, I expected arrogance. Instead, I saw calculation. "Not guilty," he said, his voice steady. His lawyer followed up with a motion to suppress the audio, claiming it had been obtained without consent. The judge denied it immediately, citing South Carolina's one-party consent law. The audio stood. Then came the civil counter, mine. We were suing Scott for emotional damages, attempted theft and defamation, as well as filing a wrongful commitment. Samantha had built a case so solid, even his most aggressive defense attorney couldn't find a crack in it. The judge scheduled the trial for 6 weeks later. During that time, I went back to my father's house and began the process of reclaiming what was mine. The locks had been changed. Scott had moved out, but not before leaving the place in shambles. Boxes of unfiled paperwork, shattered photo frames, furniture covered with sheets and dust. I found my father's final letters, notes he'd written before his stroke, tucked in the drawer of a desk in the study. Reading them was like hearing his voice again. "Don't let anyone take what I built. Don't let them convince you you're small. I didn't plan to. I met with a local contractor and started the process of restoring the property. I reopened communication with the bank and trust managers, reestablished legal access to the estate, and began working with Samantha on a plan to create a foundation in my father's name, something to protect women like me who were vulnerable to this kind of exploitation. But the fire that kept me going wasn't charity, it was justice. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. The media had latched onto the story and every outlet wanted a front row seat. I sat silently as the prosecution detailed the calculated steps Scott had taken, from convincing doctors to alter records to transferring money into hidden accounts. Witness after witness confirmed the pattern: manipulation, control, deceit. Amy testified calmly, clearly, laying out the timeline of everything she witnessed. Conroy, though disgraced, gave a deposition so damning the defense barely tried to cross-examine. They knew the battle was lost. Scott's lawyer made one last desperate attempt at character assassination. He tried to portray me as bitter, vengeful, unstable, repeating the same tactics that had worked for Scott for years. But the judge wasn't buying it. This case isn't about personality. It's about verifiable actions, and those actions show a clear pattern of abuse and exploitation. In closing arguments, Samantha stood and addressed the court. This is what power looks like when it's weaponized against vulnerability. Mr. Harper didn't just steal money, he tried to rewrite a woman's identity using mental health as a smokescreen for theft. This wasn't care, it was a con, and it nearly worked. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. As the verdict was read, Scott didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, his illusion of control finally gone. The sentencing hearing was set for the following month, but the judge remanded him into custody immediately. I watched as the bailiffs took him by the arms and led him away. He didn't resist. The performance was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters surged toward me, microphones and cameras blocking my path. One asked, "Danielle, how do you feel?" I stopped. "I feel seen," I said. And that's more than I could say when I was locked in a room, being told I was crazy. Then I walked through them, the noise fading behind me. I had reclaimed everything: my name, my life, my legacy. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. Justice had been served, but accountability was still owed by every person who had stayed silent. Every administrator who had signed the papers without question, every board member who let the system run on greed and blindness. I wasn't just going to rebuild, I was going to make sure no woman would ever be buried the way I was again, and they would remember my name, not as a patient, not as a case file, but as the one who fought her way out and never looked back. 6 months after the trial, the house finally felt like home again. The furniture was new, but the bones were still my father's. His favorite reading chair restored, his record player in the corner, the cracked oak table where he used to sit with coffee and talk about legacy like it was something you could hold. I'd scrubbed every inch of this place, not just to clean away the dust Scott had left behind, but to reclaim something deeper: control, space, breath. The foundation I started was up and running. We called it the Harper Initiative, in honor of the man who believed in integrity above everything. It offered legal aid, emergency housing, and psychiatric advocacy to women who'd been silenced through systems of control, just like I had. Amy now sat on the board, and Samantha served as legal director. We received over 70 case submissions in the first month alone. I read every one. Some were terrifyingly similar to mine. Husbands, brothers, employers, even parents who had used the same mental health loopholes to take power away from someone inconvenient. But the difference now was that those women had someone on their side. They had a name to call, a system that listened. We had made a crack in the wall, and that was how it begins. Scott was sentenced to 12 years. His appeal was denied. The judge, in her closing remarks, had said, "This court cannot allow affluence and charm to replace accountability. Mr. Harper used love as a weapon and medicine as a mask. That cannot go unpunished." I hadn't cried at the sentencing. I thought I might, but there was nothing left in me that needed that release. He had been removed from my life like a tumor. quietly, clinically, and with precision. What remained now was healing. Slow, deliberate healing. I still had bad nights. Sometimes I'd wake up thinking I was strapped to a bed again, that I'd open my eyes and see fluorescent lights and hear footsteps that didn't mean safety. But those moments passed. They came less frequently. The fear no longer ruled me. It visited, and I let it pass. Because now I had evidence, both literal and emotional, that I could survive anything. Not because I was superhuman, but because I refused to disappear. One quiet Thursday morning, I returned to Cypress Hills, not as a patient, not even as a victim, but as an inspector. The state had launched a formal review of the facility, and the Harper Initiative was invited to sit in on interviews with staff and administration. I walked through the same doors that once sealed behind me with the heavy thud of entrapment. This time I walked freely, holding a clipboard instead of a sedative. Amy was beside me, now in a pressed blouse and a state badge clipped to her pocket. We were escorted into the conference room by a visibly nervous administrator. "Thank you for coming," he said stiffly, gesturing to the chairs. "We'll begin shortly." As I sat, I glanced toward the hallway where the intake rooms were located. The memory flickered in the back of my mind, the way the restraints had bitten into my skin, the numbness from medication, the disbelief that anyone could sign you out of your own mind. But I didn't dwell on it. I didn't need to. That version of me wasn't gone. She was standing here now, in full view of everyone who once ignored her, and this time they had to look her in the eye. When the interviews began, I asked every question calmly, thoroughly. I asked about consent protocols, about patient autonomy, about red flags and reporting systems. I watched their faces shift when they realized I wasn't just someone with a grudge. I was someone who had turned her survival into a system. That was the final revenge. Not screaming, not punishment, but structure, stability, something that would outlast all of them. That evening, I drove back home and sat on the porch again. The wind was cool, and the trees moved softly, like they were trying to speak in some ancient language I almost remembered. I closed my eyes and thought about my father, what he would say if he saw me now. I didn't need to imagine long. I already knew. He'd say, "Good, now pass it on." So I did. And I will. Always. Because the moment they tried to take my voice, they gave me a louder one. The day they tried to disappear me, they made sure I'd never vanish again.